next week, for those who are planning to attend to Open Source Summit in North America that will be held in Vancouver, the Tutor Group will be hosting an OSPO Birds of a Feather and Happy Hour there. We will be discussing different topics on open source governance, open source compliance, open source strategies under the lens of the OSPO and how open source is managed within organizations. So if you're interested to attend, registration is already open as the space is limited. Regarding the recent OSPO layoffs, there has been layoffs in most of the tech industries so far, but also some OSPOs has been affected. So in Tudo, we want to highlight that there are resources there and we are here to help. And either if you are one of the persons that are hiring, you can post those open positions in the Tudo Slack channel, OSPO Jobs, and also in the OSPO News that is sent every month. And if you're looking for open positions, you can also use those channels to find open positions. For instance, the OSPO jobs that we share on April are these ones, and if you're interested, you can click on its link to learn more on those positions on OSPOs and open source. Another important event and webinar that is happening comes from our friends at OSPO at SAP that is going to be involved in ways to supporting open source communities. That will happen in 2 weeks on May 16th, and the registration is open for everyone that would like to attend. We have a new OSPOlogy maintainer. I don't know if he's here because this person usually attends to most of this OSPOlogy session. Saurabh applied to become a OSPOlogy maintainer. OSPOlogy is a repo within Tudo Group that hosts the study and open discussion on OSPOs. We have different artifacts like the OSPO News there, or the OSPO book and so on. He has been doing great contributions to the community, and I think it was last week he requested to become a maintainer, and he's still doing a great job, so kudos to him and congratulations. Just to remind that everyone is welcome to participate in the community, and there are different ways you can do so. All these meetings are being recorded and uploaded in the OSPOlogy YouTube channel. And saying that, let's move now to the topic of the MOOC. Today's motivator is going to be Dwayne O'Brien, that is here. So Dwayne is an open source leader and sustainability specialist. So Dwayne, I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now, and it's over to you.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks for getting us off and running this morning. For those who are watching, if you want to catch up with any of our panelists in person, at least 3 of them will be at Open Source Summit, but you'll have to go and find out which ones. I'm Dwayne O'Brien. I'm thrilled to have this great group of folks here with us today. I'm going to invite them each in turn to introduce themselves, and then we'll dig right in. And Chad, why don't I have you go first?
Sure thing. Thanks, Dwayne. Hi, everyone. My name is Chad Whitaker, and I head up the OSPO at a company called Sentry, which is a developer tools company. Our main product is error monitoring, application monitoring, and then we also recently acquired CodeCov, which is for test coverage. Yeah, so that's me. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Chad. Alyssa.
Hi, all. I'm Alyssa. Alyssa Wright. I am probably the open source program team at Bloomberg LP, and excited to be here. And I'll pass it off to Alex.
Hey, I'm Alex Scammon. I'm head of open source engineering at G Research, which is a quantitative research firm, fintech. Think fintech stuff in London, and I've got quite a large OSPO, between 30 and 40 people depending on how you count, and yeah, likewise super excited to be here and talking about how we think about funding in this open source world.
Awesome, thank you, Alex. Per.
Yeah, hi, my name is Per. I'll leave out the last names because they're Danish and impossible to pronounce anyways. I am the open source tech lead at Spotify. We do music streaming, if no one knows that.
Awesome, thank you, Per. And Emma.
Hello, hi everyone. My name is Emma. I work on Microsoft's open source programs office. We're a small team that works across the company, and I lead the FOSS Fund program. Really happy to be here. Nice to see everyone today.
Awesome. Thank you, Emma, and thank you for the rest of the panelists. We're all here because we care about open source sustainability, and because we are involved in one way or another in funding initiatives that hope to address problems of greater sustainability across the ecosystem. All of our organizations got started from different places, and I'd like to sort of open it up to everyone else. Who wants to talk about how you got started in sustainability funding, starting your FOSS fund, or otherwise you're getting your funding initiatives off the ground?
Plan of building the OSPO, that there was a component of hiring up people to the OSPO, but there was also a part of the plan which was we will be giving back to the broader ecosystem because it is good for us in the long run. So right from the beginning, it was part of the plan.
So your funding work was built into the initial creation of your program.
Yeah, it was part of the sort of philosophical underpinnings of what we thought was important about this initiative. So
awesome. Thanks, Alex. Chad, maybe I'll put you on the spot. Oh, Emma, I see your hand there. Thank you.
That's fine. I actually think it's a great, just a great question for anyone to ask of themselves or their companies, like how are we funding open source right now? So the FOSS fund at Microsoft actually predates me. So that was a question I was able to go and ask as part of this panel recently, and to learn that it wasn't so much that it was, sort of started so much as there was like lots of different groups and, teams already kind of doing this, and we were like sponsoring foundations, and just the function of an OSPO creating visibility to that, more formalized some of the programs, including the FOSS fund, which came there. So it was sort of like, it predates me, and it was something that was already happening, but we just started to formalize it more and be more intentional about it. So and the FOSS fund is just one of those things. But I just encourage everyone to ask that question, because you might already be started and not realize it.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Alyssa.
I would say our lineage history journey, it's been a journey. We have long been supporting organizations and foundations that support open source. So that is a bit of our DNA in terms of open, of investing in open source like sustainability. But I think it really was a lot of the work that's being done by, some of the people that, like the work that Dwayne specifically, it started with his FOSS fund that inspired, I think, a new conversation within our OSPO team about how to directly engage our technologists in that conversation. So it was not, so that a more ground up visibility, and that engagement also allowed for a broader responsibility across the company about what is the open source that is important to us, that we should be taking an active role in sustaining, not just through foundation relationships, but also through direct engagement with maintainers. I see it as an evolution of our foundational support, but really unique in that it's starting to align with the broader breadth and visibility of our technologists.
So as Alyssa talked about, we also had engaged with foundations and did our financial support through that, but we actually started from the other side by looking at our landscape. We have a high focus at Spotify, achieving this golden state, so we have a fairly similar use of technologies across our applications, and we looked at the different dependencies we had there, and then actually seeing that we had 6,000 or 7,000 references to a single open source project. Actually started that conversation from that view, saying, okay, what if this person actually stopped maintaining that project? Because some of these were one man or one person shows, and so that was actually the starting point from us. Instead of saying we want to start with funding, that's kind of a solution looking for a problem, and then we more started from the other end, saying, oh, what do we do with these 7,000 apps, depending on this one thing, if that goes away? And that's how that conversation started out.
Yes, so Sentry itself started life as an open source project, a community supported open source side project way back in 2008, and didn't really commercialize until, well, depending on how you count it, 2012, but really it didn't take venture capital to really start growing until 2015, 2016. So for many years we were just an open source side project. And the founders of the company, were kind of, I'll say, native to the open source community, and we're always supporting projects. And as Sentry's grown, they've kind of, and started commercializing. It's been important since the beginning to support other. This is where, we'll talk about some things later, like what is the open source community, right? So it's always been a part of Sentry's history to financially support open source projects that we use. Really started getting organized a couple years ago. So there's a neat story on this. Dwayne, when you were at Indeed, we were a recipient of Indeed's FOSS fund, but we had already sort of, were a couple years into our own commercialization at that point. So we were like, well, it was kind of at this inflection point for us, right? Where it's like, well, thank you for the donation. We don't really need it anymore. So we're going to turn around and regift that to others. And then kind of the year after that is when we really got organized with a kind of a systematic, I would say, program for funding open source. So kind of evolved organically and got a boost from Indeed, and then got organized a couple years ago.
Thanks, Chad. And I want to come back to Per and specifically call out something you said during your sort of overview. You did this analysis of what you relied on. You identified one project that had heavy dependency within the rest of the organization, and that was your starting point. like many organizations who have any kind of software, we all have thousands of open source dependencies kind of strewn throughout our code. That finding those important projects is a good place to start, but I'm interested to hear from the rest of the panelists. How do you make sense of the vastness of the ecosystem, and how do you make decisions about who you're going to fund and for how much?
So I think upfront saying we think that the ones we end up funding is good. We can see that we can see they're in use across the landscape. We can see engineers are pointing them out when we send out like surveys and stuff. So we can see that there's a dependency on them, but we don't know if they're the best. Like that's very hard to actually point down. We might be missing 20 other projects that actually might be better to do that. So it's an extremely hard problem to solve. And I think also, if you look at how people suggest projects, there's a vast difference how each individual team sees what is actually important. Like some would just say, oh, you should just like sponsor Linux as a general open source project that they like. And some go down to, oh, this like very specific Java testing project is important. And then you have all the things in between. And it differs widely between the teams because it's very much based on their day-to-day need. So I think that's a big challenge to sit as a centralized decision-making unit to make decisions across like a bigger landscape of needs and requirements from these different teams. So I don't have a clear answer on that. It's hard.
How do the rest of you think about this problem? Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, we did a process much like Per describes. One thing that we ran into in that process was we could see all of the libraries that we used, and we could see which ones we used the most, and then we went to go and offer them funds, and they weren't set up to actually receive any funds. They weren't either in, GitHub sponsors didn't exist at the time when we tried to do this. Open Collective, they weren't signed up on Open Collective or some other thing. And we actually had to do a bunch of outreach and work to get people signed up into a place where we could actually offer them however much money a month, because we thought highly of them. And some people didn't want to do it even. And so,
I was going to say, did it work, Alex? What, was it like 50-50? What was your, between folks that wanted it and folks that didn't?
I suppose most of them eventually signed up. Most of them saw the value of having some pizza money at the end of the day.
And you kind of steered them towards one of the established platforms. You're like, hey, go sign up on Open Collective or whatever. You said GitHub sponsors wasn't live yet.
Yeah. And, you know, we prefer in most cases to people to create GitHub sponsorship around a project rather than to a specific person. You know, we're fine to sponsor particular humans as well. We would prefer to focus on a project rather than having a single person that we're delivering money to. There was one other point, I guess I'll come back to it later. But yeah, it was interesting that at the time it was actually rather difficult. I think, I'll come back to the last point later. Sorry, okay. I'll leave it there.
I echo some of that learning. It seems to be continually learning. How do we identify projects and people to sponsor? Speaking specifically around our FOSS fund, the most success we've had is really engaging employees and engineers working with open source to try and understand who they think that we should be sponsoring, and just really we surface those as part of a nomination process. And so one of the challenges is that we get big, really well-known projects and then some smaller ones. But we put those up to a vote, which is something we're evolving as well, and we find that the participation of FOSS funds, where nominations come from employees, are the most impactful. So because we have that knowledge, that institutional knowledge, that passion, people can speak to how the money will be used. That really goes a long way. Versus, I've also done funds where it's based on use, and people who, especially because we have a voting-based FOSS fund, are less likely to engage because they don't quite understand. They see the numbers, but how is this project going to use the money? How can is this what they need? Because there's different things that projects need at different points in time. And so I just say, like, the human piece of getting people to advocate for open source projects or funding has been really helpful to us. And again, like, the numbers are important, the use is important, but the intersection of that somehow is the way that we've been able to have impact there.
I think similarly, so our FOSS fund, starts with a vote that goes wide to all employees at Bloomberg to nominate projects that are kind of critical for their work. And then we've continuing to evolve this rubric where the number of votes is a critical piece to the rubric, but other things that we're looking to pay attention to are we already funding the project through foundation directed foundation support, might disqualify something? Is there some sort of conflict of interest that is maybe not apparent? Is this somebody's like own personal project that they're doing on the side that maybe we shouldn't be writing a $10,000 check to? You know, so we have a rubric that helps us surface what we call like the short list, and then with voters, with other open source like reviewers that are within the organization, and with the OSPO team, we kind of take that initial short list and we put it down to a five vote ballot. That's what it looked like to date. We're only in our second our second vote, which is so we're about 6 months in. We're doing 3 votes every quarter, so second round. And I think that this will be something that we will continue to evolve. But the vote and people voting and people advocating for things is really, like the first critical piece, being able to distinguish like what should we, where should kind of FOSS funding go towards.
It's interesting. There's a even though I knew this tension was sort of a running thread between your different stories, it was interesting to hear it come out. This bias in one direction towards centralizing the decision making for people who have a good view of the landscape, and broadening the decision making for people who are closer to the everyday technology. There's things to think about in terms of how to make the most efficient decisions versus how to make them decisions that have the largest buy-in amongst the organization. And I just wonder how you all think about balancing that tension.
I think it's a really good thing to dive into. I think the way we have it right now with an OSPO kind of having as a central point is, I don't think that's the best way. But I think you need to have it as a first step to kind of mature the organization into thinking that you actually do need to fund open source in some way to have it sustainable. But ideally, you would treat this as any other kind of dependency you have in your organization. You treat it as a risk and you deal with that risk in some way. Where if a team has a dependency on an Oracle database, they have an account manager, they follow the roadmap, and they do all the due diligence to make sure that that dependency is healthy. And we haven't really gotten there with open source yet. That we look at an open source dependency and what can we do with that relationship? Can we turn them into a vendor? Can we buy something from them? Can we give them money to make sure that that critical dependency we have as a team stays healthy and we can keep depending on them? And we don't treat it as like a normal business thing yet. I'm sure it will come over time as we mature this thinking of just treating open source as any other kind of risk management we really have to do. I know that sounds boring, but ideally we would, in my view, distribute this out into the teams that actually have the dependency, and they can take it from their budget just like they're buying an Oracle license or something else. So that would be my ideal version of it, but I know we have a lot of steps to get there, like culturally.
Chad, I saw both of your hands go up at the same time as Per.
Yeah, I'm digesting what Per is saying. It's more centralized at Sentry, and I don't think that's not. I think some of it's probably just the different size of organization. Sentry's only 3 to 50 people, so we, and another part of it too is like Sentry. We think of ourselves as part of the open source community. We're an open source company. It's like central to our identity and our self-understanding, and part of that is like, we only run our program once a year, which is different than I think others in this room. And we do take this blended approach. There's this question between centralization and decentralization. There's another question between like, are you funding 5 projects or are you funding 500 projects? And are you going for that long tail of all the little projects? Or are you trying to, go for the kind of larger amounts to some? So, we take this blended approach, right? Like we're, as I think everyone on the call is doing. But yeah, I'm chewing on this thought pair that it's like it should be pushed down and decentralized, and it should be like you manage your Oracle license, you also have the engineering teams on it. I guess we're pretty centralized because we've got the basics of our program. It's like what are the main languages and frameworks that we depend on, and what are the foundations behind them. So there's like 8 foundations. But then within those ecosystems, what are the long tail projects for each? And we, use dependency analysis. I know Armin's from ThanksDev on here, and there's like all these newer tools and platforms to help with that kind of dependency analysis and funding the long tail. But even that is kind of centralized. And then we just run a 2-week voting period that's like, hey, give us everything else. Like, but it's definitely an 80-20 or something. It feels like it's primarily this centralized approach, but a little bit orthogonal, right? Because there's that centralized, decentralized, but then there's like few and many. So we're like pretty far on the centralized side, I'd say, but also pretty far into the many side.
There's so much I feel like we could dig into here on the idea of centralized OSPO versus decentralized open source practices, and we can't talk about everything at once on the same thing. So I want to move us along to sort of the question of what we've learned individually or collectively in the process of running our programs. All of them sound like they're 3 to 4 years old, although Alex, yours might be older than we know. So what's the most important thing you've learned in your funding work today?
I don't know about important, but in terms of interesting, how much offering to fund something changes the conversation entirely, where somebody is doing a project for free because they enjoy it, and you offer them $50 a month and they will get offended, and perhaps quite rightly. You know, while our point is that it shouldn't just be us funding this thing, the whole community should be chipping in $50 a month, and all together we can make this whole ecosystem work. Therefore, what we're doing by funding you for a small amount per month is actually exhibiting the correct behavior of that the entire industry should be exhibiting. It nevertheless can come across as mean and tight-fisted from a financial tech company that makes money for itself. So, like, it's a very delicate conversation to have. There's also very complex interactions between people who live in the West and people who live in third world countries, and like what it means, like what money means, is different to different people in the world. And it's like we haven't even touched on the complexities of any of that stuff so far. We could go for another several days talking about how all of that web of complexity comes together. So yeah, just some interesting thoughts. I don't know whether any of them are important or what, but
I think many of them are important. We just what about the rest of you? What's something important that you've learned in your funding work? Go ahead, Alyssa.
Well, I would say you had mentioned, it seems like many of you have been doing this for a couple of years now. So our FOSS fund is very young. We're only 6 months in, but it was a very long process to get here. And so one thing I have definitely learned is that you know, I guess depending on your organization, but it can take it's a cultural shift to be able to put a program together where you give out small amounts of money to projects, you know, like that, and that getting that paperwork and process down was a big learning experience. Once said though, and now that we're in this place of like actually being in action, the things that I've learned have been about aligning the business interests of, you know, open source engineering development and like in Bloomberg specifically, are like big philanthropic efforts. And so this is really a space where both like business good or business objectives and public good align, and being able to work with corporate philanthropies towards seeing how we can accelerate this impact is really exciting. And so and hopefully just one, like the FOSS Fund initiative being one piece of like a larger portfolio of ways that we can like support and sustain open source for the public good. So, and it's been a little bit of a shift of my own language, working with corporate philanthropy, and people's excitement to do philanthropic work within the Bloomberg, like people wanted to do good stuff, is not like, has also made me aware of my own language for when I talk about the value of open source. And again, not just business value, it's world value as well. So I've learned a lot about working with philanthropy efforts, and not that this is a philanthropy effort, I want to be clear. It is a lot around business objectives, but I think that it has a space where it can align different types of missions, within an organization. And
I think it's worth calling out, Alyssa, that Bloomberg's relationship to philanthropy and philanthropic work is different. It's unique to your organization compared to the others. And identifying the thing that is unique about your organization and how to take advantage of that in your work in open source sustainability is the thing to be looking for. Mm-hmm. Emma, I see your hand.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I have learned in the questions that I'm interested in solving come after kind of that first funding, again, just focused on FOSS Fund, like that sustainability piece is still elusive. And I know this is true, or this is something I've learned from talking to maintainers that we funded, like asking them, like how did this help you, or what challenges did you experience afterwards, and kind of hearing that, it was great to have some of this funding. One of the maintainers was sharing with me, but now like how do I distribute this to like, how do I balance like paid and non-paid contributors at like the whole governance model challenge exists. And so I think that's something that I'm learning and trying to figure out. So we, how do we help maintainers then sustain their projects? And there's also attributes of, educating the next generation of maintainers to step in. Like there's so many pieces where the funding kicks off that, but, and is it our role to kind of like provide additional support in some way? Like, so again, what I've learned is, yes, like this is definitely, funding is definitely a great first step, but it opens the door to other challenges. And I think as a collective, however we can figure out how to like move that needle and create that sustainability, opportunity, growth and maturity, I guess, is what we're talking about, then the better for the ecosystem. So that's the thing I've learned.
Thanks, Emma. I want to call, we've got about 9 minutes left in the webinar. If you have questions, please do drop them in. We'll pivot to questions here in a little bit. If you don't have questions, I will keep asking questions of the panel. Para, I see your hand. You're on mute. Yay!
Finally, like webinar bingo complete. Anyways, so I think we've done two interesting things. One is like giving a bigger amount is actually very important for the maintainers. They give them a longer runway of money to know how long they can actually set aside time. So we set a minimum spend of 10,000 euros per our project. So we funded a way smaller number of projects than we actually could. So that's one thing that does mean a lot to the maintainers that they have that runway. And the second one is that we were surprised to actually see that the projects we funded, we didn't actually see any employees started contributing to them or engaging with the projects, even though they were given quite a lot of like attention inside of Spotify. We didn't see like employees started engaging with them. We expected otherwise, but that's just I think we noticed that first.
That's interesting. And Emma, I know you called out in particular in some of our conversations that your program was as much about growing a culture of contributing back to those projects as it was about supporting the projects. So I wonder if you have any comments or thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I think culture is a huge part of this, right? Like creating the awareness of the supply chain, the software we're using, and our responsibility to contribute back, and the opportunity to contribute back continues to be an ongoing conversation. And the FOSS Fund specifically has helped us do that, because in order to vote, you have had to have made a contribution to open source. And that's not just like, go do this thing. It also raises awareness of the ways that we might be contributing to open source that might not be traditional. So you're on a board, you're like helping with a code of conduct enforcement piece. So just building that culture, I think, is huge. The people part of this is, really central. So we continue to try and teach as much as a way to activate.
And I see your hand there. Are you going to ask Serkan's question?
Yeah, now we have a lot of questions. I don't know
Excellent.
if we're going to get the chance to answer all. But so the first question was in the chat. So since open source software is getting recognized as a digital infrastructure, what do you think about establishing open source funds at the national level, similar to Sovereign Tech Fund in Germany?
What do the panelists think? Go ahead, Chad. I think your hand was up first.
I think it's just great. I didn't know about the Sovereign Tech Fund. I'm just looking at the website now, and I'm down here in the FAQ, and it says, it's funded by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and its total fund is 11.5 million euro for 2023. I think that's great. That's a lot of money. That's way more money than any of us are giving, right? That's fantastic. I think, open source is not monolithic. We talked about centralization, decentralization kind of differences. Like the chunk of open source that we're really talking about when we're talking about sustainability is a common pool resource, and it's a public good. And for the historically the way public goods have been funded is with taxes, right? So yeah, I mean, what we're seeing here with this Sovereign Tech Fund, I think, is a fantastic way to approach it. Because I look up at the projects they're funding, and it's like projects. We funded Bundler Ruby Gems, OpenSSH, OpenBGPD, curl, OpenML, like $11 million euro for these kind of projects. I mean, this is great.
I'll tip my hand as moderator, even though it's bad moderator practice, and give my sort of one-liner in this case, which is that state-level governments are some of the biggest consumers of software in the world, and getting them involved in the maintenance of that software is good for everyone. How we do that is very important. I'll bring us on to the next question. I think I'll take this one and get thoughts from the panelists. From an anonymous attendee, how do we align with the interests of shareholders for billion-dollar companies who see open source support as altruism, perhaps, or open washing? Open source licensing says it's free, but is it really? What do you all think? Go ahead, Alex.
I mean, you know, I want to kick to make sure that we're all talking about the actual dollar value of what our OSPOs bring. And, you know, this is something that we've built in to our work from the beginning. And so when you're talking to people up the chain, board of directors, and what are you doing, being able to talk business with them about actually how much money you are either making them or saving them goes a long way. It is the conversation that you have to have. And because we've done that, we have been very successful in what we've done over the past 5 years. And I actually, part of the reason I'm on a kick to talk about this is because I see too few of us doing that. But I think it's also incredibly easy if we put our minds to it, because open source is so valuable. It is incontrovertible. We are very, very important and very, very monetarily valuable to our shareholders. We just need to be able to articulate that better. So anyway, that's my quick spiel on that.
With just a couple minutes left and another great question that we got during the chat, I want to steer us toward a closing question. So the question we got in chat was, once you decide which open source projects to sponsor, what is typically the process of providing the funding for the project? What mechanisms do you use for that, and what obstacles do you face? If I was to broaden that a little bit, and in general, and I'll call on each of the panelists in turn, starting with Alyssa, what advice would you give to someone who wants to start their own funding program? The questions that we got there are very, very, very tactical and about how we go about this once we've decided to do it. So what advice do you have?
Sure. First, I would look at there is good documentation online about how things have been structured from O'Reilly, authored by Dwayne and his team. And this provides a really good framework for what kinds of projects to consider in a FOSS fund, like nomination, who you might consider to be eligible voters, how you might want to, what tools you might want to use in order to transfer, funds within your own organization to a project wallet. So those, I think in many respects, I feel like a lot of the tactical questions are being answered by people in this group. It looks different, for all of us, but we kind of have very a similar framework underway. And then from there, for me, it was really engaging with the people who are also passionate about this work, so that you're not doing it alone internally. This rubric has been really instrumental in helping us trying to understand what our own priorities are for putting together an election ballot. And then from the election ballot, it's really how high and how far to get the message across. Because the most engagement is one of the ways that we measure the success of the FOSS fund.
Thanks, Alyssa. Go ahead, Alex.
Really quick, I mean, if anyone's trying to start this up and wants help convincing executives, board members, high-level ranking people, I would suggest reaching out to any one of us and having us go and have a conversation with your people, because we might be able to articulate the actual value that it's bringing to our organizations, which you may not have the data on yet. And I would be interested in talking. I'm sure the others on this call are probably happy to as well. So.
Emma, advice for people who are beginning their journeys.
Be curious. I was just answering a question around, interesting that the stakeholders went in chat. Really understanding that people are coming from different backgrounds where they've never experienced open source. I think many of us come from that background where we get it. We participate in communities, we understand what we can achieve and what we gain and all those inspirational things. But some folks come in not, understanding that at all, and that's through no fault of their own. That's where their life experiences brought them. And so I guess as you're starting to be curious about where people are, instead of making assumptions or, speaking to inspirationally at first, that business value, getting to where people are, I think is my advice on where to start. And of course, leveraging what a lot of we've all built, collaborating with us, building on each other's work. I think that's how we impact the ecosystem there. So don't go it alone either, I guess would be my other advice.
Awesome. Thank you, Emma. Per, advice for people beginning their journey.
I think two things. One, the argument of it's the right thing to do does not work with finance people at all. Like just don't go there. Find out what actually worked for them. It's typically talking about risk reduction and managing dependencies and so on.
Unless you're talking about corporate philanthropy, then
yeah, there's one.
Yeah.
Go work at Bloomberg and talk about the right things to do. It's like, and I think the other thing is keep it small and simple. Like, find one platform, go with GitHub sponsor the things you can do through there, and then in the next round make it more complicated. I think start small, and that's you will have a lot of time spent on talking to people managing all this anyway. So start simple.
Awesome. Thank you. Chad, close us out. Advice for people beginning their journey.
Do it. Everything everybody else has already said, but yeah, chip away. There's tons of resources. It's so much. Look, I got started in funding open source over 10 years ago, and like the tools, the platforms, the people, like we're so much further along than we were. We were just talking with Daniel Stenberg Curl. He's 25 years, right? Like, there's been a lot of improvement. No better time than now to jump in and make some progress on this for your company.
Awesome. Thanks, Chad. And Anna, I'm going to hand it back to you after I thank Alex, Alyssa, Chad, Emma, and Per for your great insights and for sharing the conversation with us today. Back over to you, Anna.
And
Thanks,
also thank to you, Duane, for moderating and doing this great panel discussion. I do have to say there were two questions that were not answered but are written in the OSPOlogy discussion. So when you have time, you can answer to them async. And for everyone that has been until the end, thank you so much. This will be the panel discussion will be uploaded into the OSPOlogy repo soon. To end up with, is there any announcement, last comment you would like to share here? So saying that, thanks everyone, and see you in the next OSPOlogy meeting. And thank you everyone for participating.